A 7-year-old girl knelt on the frozen steps of a Denver mansion, clutching her baby brother as tears streamed down her cheeks. Beside her stood Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd, pressing close to shield Emily Parker and little Ethan from the cruel world that had just cast them out. Their stepmother's voice echoed like thunder, accusing them of theft, while a suitcase and bottle lay scattered in the snow. In that moment, fate intervened. A soldier named David Collins stopped in his tracks, his heart breaking at the sight. What he did next would change their lives forever. What followed is a story of betrayal, courage, and the miracle of second chances. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever be left out in the cold, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear may restore your faith in family, love, and hope. The winter sky over Denver had a brittle, metallic quality that morning, the kind of cold where the air seemed to sting the lungs with each breath. Snow from the night before clung stubbornly to the edges of the sidewalks, leaving patches of white crust that glistened in the pale sunlight. The wind rolled down from the Rocky Mountains, sharp and unyielding, rattling the bare branches of the trees that lined the long avenue leading to the Parker estate. The mansion stood at the far end, its tall windows framed by heavy curtains, and though the architecture was meant to look stately and proud, the house carried an aura of mourning. Inside its walls, silence pressed against the air, thick and suffocating, for Richard Parker, the head of the family, had died just 2 weeks earlier from what was declared a sudden heart failure. His absence lingered in every corner of the house. In the living room, sitting stiffly on a long velvet couch, was Emily Parker. At 7 years old, Emily had the delicate features of a child not yet hardened by life, but her large eyes, an unusual gray blue, like rain clouds before a storm, had already seen too much sorrow. She was small for her age, with straight, chestnut-brown hair that fell unevenly around her shoulders, a result of hurried, careless trimming by the household staff. She wore a simple woolen dress that had once been her favorite but now looked too somber in the heavy air. In her arms she clutched Ethan, her 10-month-old baby brother, whose round cheeks flushed pink from the warmth of her embrace. Ethan's small hands pawed gently at her sleeve, his soft golden hair a faint crown under the dim light. He was too young to understand loss, too young to know that the father he had never truly met was gone. Emily's hold on him was not just sisterly affection. It was fierce, protective, as if she knew she was the only shield between him and the cruel world that threatened to swallow them. Lying obediently at Emily's feet was Max, the German shepherd that had been with the family since Richard had adopted him 5 years earlier. Max was a powerful dog, 6 years old now, with a strong black and tan coat and striking amber eyes that glowed with intelligence. His ears stood tall, always alert, and his chest was broad with a proud carriage that made him look like a soldier on constant patrol. Yet when Emily stroked his fur, he relaxed, his loyalty to the girl unquestionable. Max had once been trained in obedience classes by Richard himself, and the bond between dog and man had been remarkable. Now that loyalty had shifted to the children, especially Emily, as though Max sensed she was the one carrying her father's mantle of protection. The sound of heels striking wood echoed through the wide hallway, sharp and impatient. It was Madeline Parker, the second wife of Richard. At 36, Madeline was tall and carried herself with an elegance that seemed rehearsed. Her hair, a sleek golden blonde, was always styled into a perfect wave that brushed her shoulders, and her pale blue eyes were cold, calculating, with a sharpness that unnerved those around her. At the funeral, she had played the role of the grieving widow flawlessly. Her black dress fitted perfectly, her smile gracious, her voice soft and trembling in front of guests. Yet once the mourners were gone, the mask had slipped. Beneath the polished exterior was a woman hardened by greed and vanity, a woman who had grown up in a family that valued appearances over love. She had married Richard less out of affection and more out of ambition, for the wealth and status that came with the Parker name. Now that Richard was gone, her ambition had turned into hunger. Madeline strode into the living room, her perfume arriving a second before she did, a heavy, expensive scent that seemed to choke the air. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on Emily, who instinctively tightened her grip around Ethan. Emily's small shoulders tensed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had learned in the short 2 weeks since her father's passing that Madeline's soft voice could turn into a blade at any moment. "You're still sitting there, clinging to that baby like some rag doll," Madeline said, her tone dripping with disdain. "This house needs order now, not childish tears." Emily wanted to respond, to say that this was still her father's house, that Richard had promised her once by the fireplace that no one would ever take it away. But her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she lowered her gaze, pressing Ethan closer to her chest. Max let out a low growl, quiet but unmistakable. Behind Madeline appeared Kyle Turner, a man in his late 30s who was tall with a lean frame. His face bore the rough edges of someone who had once been handsome, but now looked worn by ambition and late nights. His dark brown hair was always slicked back, and his brown eyes had a certain restless gleam to them, the kind that belonged to gamblers and schemers. Kyle had once tried his hand at running a small investment firm, but failures piled up, debts grew, and by the time he met Madeline at a charity event, he was desperate. Their affair had been as much a business arrangement as it was romantic, a pact built on mutual desire for wealth. His loyalty to Madeline was less about love and more about survival. "Richard's photos are still everywhere," Kyle muttered, gesturing to the frames on the walls. "You really ought to get rid of them." Madeline's lips curled into a thin smile. "That's exactly what I've been saying. Enough of these reminders. This house belongs to me now." At that, Emily raised her head, her small voice trembling, yet insistent. "No. My dad said... He said this house is for me and Ethan. He told me." Madeline's eyes narrowed, her words sharp as knives. "Shut your mouth, child. You know nothing. If you want to stay under this roof, you'll learn to keep quiet." Emily's eyes filled with tears, though she fought to keep them from spilling. She was too young to understand legal documents or inheritance laws, but she was old enough to know something was being stolen. Max stood suddenly, his body stiff, his eyes fixed on Kyle. His low growl rumbled deeper, his hackles rising as if to say, "This is wrong." At that moment, a voice cut through the tension. Rebecca Lawson, the Parker family's longtime attorney, entered the room. Rebecca was a woman in her early 40s, of medium height, with warm brown eyes and a calm presence that could steady even the most frantic of situations. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, and she wore a gray suit that gave her an air of authority. Rebecca was known for her integrity. She had worked with Richard for over a decade and had always put the children's welfare above everything. She carried a folder in her hands, her voice firm yet even. "Mrs. Parker, I must remind you, Richard's will is clear. The estate belongs to Emily and Ethan. You are listed only as their guardian, and that role is conditional. You must provide proper care under legal supervision." Madeline's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile in Rebecca's presence. "I know, Rebecca. You don't need to repeat it every hour." Rebecca's eyes softened as she turned toward Emily, who looked back at her with a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, Emily felt as though someone was standing on her side. But when Rebecca left the room a moment later to answer a phone call, Madeline's cold stare swept back to Emily like a shadow, and the fragile spark of hope dimmed once more. Kyle leaned lazily against the doorframe, his lips curling into a smirk. "You heard the lawyer, Maddie. All it takes is one little excuse, a mistake, and those brats won't be your problem anymore." Madeline's smile returned, thin and cruel. "Yes, one small excuse. That's all it takes." Emily clutched Ethan tightly, her heart racing. Though she could not fully understand their words, she knew danger had crept closer. Max pressed his body against her leg, his eyes never leaving Kyle. In the mansion that once felt safe, the walls now seemed to whisper threats. The snow outside continued to fall lightly, blanketing Denver in a deceptive peace. But inside the Parker estate, a storm was already gathering, one that would soon threaten to tear the children's fragile world apart. The following morning in Denver dawned with a dim, silver haze. A light fog hovered over the rooftops, softening the outlines of the tall buildings downtown and curling through the trees that lined the Parker estate's drive. The air carried the sharp scent of frost, promising that more snow was on its way. Inside the mansion, however, the chill came not from the weather, but from the tension that clung to every wall. Emily sat at the foot of the grand staircase, cradling Ethan on her lap, while Max lay stretched across the carpet beside her. The German shepherd's ears flicked at every sound, his eyes following the movement of shadows as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. Madeline had spent the early morning giving orders to the staff, her voice rising and falling like a whip. Though outwardly composed, her features were sharper now, her patience visibly thinner. She had changed from a black morning dress into a fitted cream-colored suit that emphasized her height and her carefully maintained figure. The diamonds at her ears sparkled even in the dim hallway light, as if she wanted everyone to remember she was still mistress of this house. Kyle Turner was never far from her side. He leaned in a chair near the parlor, his tie loose, tapping a cigarette against a silver case. His expression carried the smugness of someone who believed he was always one step ahead, though his restless fingers betrayed his anxiety. In the background moved the household staff, though fewer than before. Many of the older servants had resigned quietly after Richard's death, unwilling to serve under Madeline's rule. Only a handful remained, including Clara, a young maid in her 20s. Clara was of medium height with a plain face framed by wisps of dark hair that escaped her bun. She had gentle brown eyes that often looked down at the floor when Madeline was near. Clara had come from a poor immigrant family and worked tirelessly to support her younger siblings back home. Though timid, she had a streak of compassion that surfaced when no one else was looking, and she sometimes slipped small comforts to Emily, an extra cookie, a warm blanket when Madeline wasn't watching. Emily sat quietly, whispering to Ethan and stroking Max's fur. She tried to distract herself by drawing little shapes with her finger on the carpet, but her heart thudded with unease. She could still hear Kyle's words from the night before echoing in her mind. All it takes is one little excuse. That excuse came sooner than she imagined. Later that day, as the fog lifted and sunlight streamed pale and cold into the living room, Kyle sauntered in with his usual air of carelessness. He carried his leather wallet in one hand, flipping it open and shut. Then, as Emily passed through the room carrying Ethan's blanket, Kyle moved with deceptive quickness. He brushed past her, and with the sleight of hand of someone who had long practiced deceit, slipped a single folded dollar bill into the pocket of her dress. Emily barely noticed, but Max did. The dog's ears pricked, his amber eyes narrowing on Kyle's hand. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but Emily hushed him, not knowing what had just occurred. Seconds later, Kyle snapped his fingers and clutched at his pocket dramatically. "My wallet!" he shouted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "Where's my money?" "Who's been near this table?" Madeline entered almost immediately, her heels clicking across the wooden floor. "What is going on now?" she demanded. Kyle's eyes darted directly to Emily. "The girl," he said coldly. "She was right here." She must have taken it. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. "No!" she cried, shaking her head fiercely. "I didn't! I never touched your wallet." But Kyle strode forward, his hand reaching for her pocket. Emily instinctively tried to shield Ethan with one arm, stumbling backward, while Max stepped between them, his teeth bared, the fur along his spine bristling. "Control that beast!" Kyle snapped, though his voice carried a tremor. Madeline's eyes gleamed as though she had been waiting for this moment. She brushed past Kyle and, with a theatrical motion, reached into Emily's pocket. From it she withdrew the folded dollar bill, holding it high between two fingers as if it were damning evidence. "Here it is," Madeline said triumphantly. "Proof of what I've suspected all along. This child is a thief." The room fell silent except for Ethan's sudden wail of confusion. Emily's eyes blurred with tears, her face burning with shame and desperation. "It's not true!" "I swear I didn't take it. Please, you have to believe me." Her voice cracked, trembling under the weight of an accusation she could not fight. Clara, standing near the doorway with a tray, froze in shock. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but quickly lowered her eyes again. Fear of losing her job strangled her courage, though her heart ached for Emily. Max let out another growl, louder this time, advancing a step toward Madeline. The woman flinched slightly, then masked it with disdain. "Get rid of that animal before it attacks someone," she barked. Emily dropped to her knees, clutching Ethan to her chest and pulling Max close with her free arm. Her sobs shook her small body as she whispered, "Please, Max, don't leave me. Please, don't take us away." The drama spilled onto the front steps of the mansion. Madeline had already prepared a suitcase, small, worn, and far too light for children who were supposed to call this place home. She flung it onto the stone steps, the thud echoing down the frosted drive. The lid burst open, scattering a few clothes into the snow. A glass baby bottle rolled onto the pavement, clinking softly before coming to rest against the wrought iron gate. Take your brother and leave, Madeline spat, her voice shrill. I will not raise another woman's children, let alone thieves. Emily stumbled after the suitcase, clutching Ethan so tightly he whimpered against her shoulder. Her fingers scrambled to retrieve the baby bottle, trembling so violently that she almost dropped it again. Max bounded down the steps and snatched one of Ethan's blankets in his jaws, bringing it to Emily's side as though determined that nothing of the babies be left behind. From across the street, Margaret Lewis watched from behind her lace curtains. Margaret was a woman in her late 60s, widowed for many years, with silver hair always pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She had kind eyes, though sharpened by years of observation, for she had lived alone since her husband's passing and found solace in keeping an eye on the neighborhood. She was used to idle gossip, but what she saw now made her stomach twist. A little girl was on her knees in the snow, clutching her baby brother while a suitcase lay open beside her, and a fierce dog tried desperately to shield them. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with outrage and pity. "Mom, please," Emily sobbed, turning back toward the doorway where Madeline stood like a marble statue. "Please don't throw us out." "I didn't do anything wrong." But Madeline's expression was unmoved. Kyle stood behind her with folded arms, a smirk curling his lips as if he had just played the winning hand. Inside, Clara stood frozen near the curtains, tears burning behind her eyes. She wanted to run to Emily, to gather her and the baby inside, but fear rooted her feet to the floor. She knew if she spoke out, she would be dismissed that very instant, and her family back home would suffer for it. So she stood silently, her heart breaking with every second. The snow began to fall again, thin flakes drifting down like ash. Emily shivered, her breath puffing in the cold air. Ethan whimpered against her shoulder, and Max pressed close, his body heat the only barrier between them and the bitter wind. Then, from the iron gate at the end of the drive, a deep voice rang out with authority, cutting through the scene like thunder. "That's enough." All heads turned toward the sound. There, framed by the swirling snow, stood a tall figure in a worn brown military coat, his posture straight despite the weight of a leather duffel slung over his shoulder. His face was lean, lined with the scars of both age and experience. His eyes, a piercing steel gray, scanned the scene before him. The crying child, the wailing baby, the angry stepmother, the smirking lover, and hardened with fury. It was David Collins, Richard Parker's old friend, a man who had served as a soldier overseas and carried both the discipline of war and the invisible wounds of battle. He had promised Richard years ago that if anything ever happened, he would look after the children. Until this moment, he had never thought that promise would truly be tested. David Collins stood at the gate, the cold Denver wind tugging at the hem of his weathered military coat. He dropped his duffel bag to the ground, his boots crunching on the snow as he moved forward with the steady gait of a man who had marched through deserts and battlefields. His face bore the faint scars of old injuries, one above his right brow, another along his jawline, but it was his eyes, steel gray and unwavering, that silenced the chaos around him. Emily froze on the steps, her arms tightening around Ethan while Max bounded forward, tail raised high. The German shepherd barked once, sharply, then trotted straight to David, circling him before pressing against his leg as if greeting an old comrade. David bent down briefly, his gloved hand brushing Max's head. "Good boy," he murmured. And in that instant, Emily felt something she had not felt since her father's death: safety. Madeline's expression faltered before hardening again. She crossed her arms, the sharp lines of her cream-colored suit cutting against the soft winter light. "What are you doing here, David?" Her voice trembled slightly, though she masked it with disdain. "I came to honor a promise," David replied, his tone low but unyielding. "Richard asked me years ago if anything ever happened to him, I would look after his children, and I intend to keep that promise." Kyle snorted from behind her, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the snowy stones. "This isn't your business, soldier boy. You don't live here. You don't decide what happens in this house." David's gaze flicked to Kyle, steady and piercing. "You're right. I don't live here. But I've lived enough to recognize cowardice when I see it, and right now, I see a man trying to destroy a child's spirit over a dollar bill." His voice carried the weight of command, the kind that had once ordered men into combat zones, and even Kyle flinched despite himself. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as David strode closer. He crouched down to her level, his rough hand surprisingly gentle as he touched her trembling shoulder. "Emily," he said softly, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. I believe you." Her tears spilled freely as she buried her face into his coat. the heavy fabric smelling faintly of leather and gun oil, a scent both foreign and comforting. Ethan, sensing the shift, reached his tiny hand toward David's chest, clutching at the soldier's dog tag chain that peeked from beneath his collar. The little boy cooed softly, and for the first time he relaxed in someone's arms other than Emily's. Max pressed against them, his amber eyes bright and alert, as if already recognizing David as part of their pack. Madeline's lips curled into a sneer. How touching, but this is still my house, and those children are under my guardianship. Guardianship is not ownership, David said firmly, standing tall again. And if you continue treating them like this, you'll lose even that. At that moment, the sound of a car door closing drew everyone's attention. From the driveway came Rebecca Lawson, the Parker family attorney, her gray suit buttoned against the cold. She carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that mixed curiosity with suspicion. Rebecca was in her early 40s, slim, with brown hair streaked lightly with gray at the temples. She had sharp, intelligent eyes, but also a warmth that softened her features when she looked at children. She had known David through Richard, though only in passing. Seeing him standing protectively in front of Emily and Ethan seemed to confirm everything Richard had once told her about his trust in his friend. "David?" Rebecca called, striding toward them. "What's going on here?" David gestured to Emily and Ethan. "What's going on is these children were thrown out into the snow over a false accusation. I won't stand for it." Rebecca's eyes flicked to Madeline. "Is this true?" Madeline raised her chin defiantly. "The girl was caught stealing. I will not tolerate such behavior." Emily's small voice broke through, trembling but clear. "I didn't do it, Miss Lawson." I swear Rebecca's heart ached at the sight of her red cheeks from the cold, tears streaking her face, the baby whimpering in her arms. She turned back to Madeline. "Even if there was proof, which I doubt, you cannot throw them out. Guardianship requires care and safety. This behavior could jeopardize your role," Kyle muttered under his breath. Always the lawyer with her rules. Rebecca ignored him and focused on David. "I see you've stepped in already." "Good. These children need someone they can trust right now." David nodded. "I'll take them somewhere safe tonight." "They can't stay here another minute," Madeline's fury flared. "You can't just walk out with them." Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out a document. "Actually, under the emergency clause in Richard's will, if the children are at risk, temporary guardianship can be assigned to a trusted party until a court hearing. I'll file this immediately. Until then, they go with David." Madeline's face blanched, and Kyle ground his cigarette into the snow with unnecessary force. Emily looked up at David with wide, hopeful eyes. "Can we really go?" David offered her a reassuring smile, one corner of his mouth lifting beneath his scar. "Yes, Emily." "You're coming with me," Max barked once, almost as if in approval. That evening, David brought the children to a small apartment he had rented downtown since leaving the military. The building was modest, with brick walls and narrow staircases, but the rooms were warm. He set Emily and Ethan on the couch, found extra blankets, and lit the small fireplace. Emily looked around curiously, her eyes catching on the framed photograph of David in uniform with his old squadron. She studied the men's smiling faces, their arms thrown around each other, dusty desert terrain in the background. David noticed and came to sit beside her. "Those are my brothers," he explained softly. "Not by blood, but by choice. We looked out for each other no matter what." He glanced at her, his voice lowering. "That's what I'll do for you and Ethan, too." "Look out for you." No matter what, Ethan stirred and began fussing. David tried awkwardly to prepare a bottle, his large hands clumsy with the task. Milk spilled onto the counter, and Emily giggled through her tears. "You don't know how to do it," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "No," David admitted with a sheepish grin. "But you can teach me." Max lay near the door, ears alert to every sound from the hallway. His eyes tracked every shadow, his body tense until he finally lay his head down on his paws, satisfied that the children were safe for now. Later, as the city lights flickered outside the window, David sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Memories of Richard's voice haunted him. "Promise me, if something happens, you'll protect them." David clenched his jaw. He had lost too many brothers in war. He would not lose Richard's children to greed. The Denver streets were alive with a brittle cold that evening. Neon lights reflected off patches of melting snow, painting the sidewalks in hues of red and green. David Collins walked briskly back to his modest apartment with groceries under one arm: milk, bread, a few cans of beans. He had left Emily and Ethan with Max for only half an hour, but he moved with the urgency of a soldier who never fully shed the instinct to return to his post quickly. When he reached the building, he found Emily sitting on the couch with Ethan asleep against her chest, whispering a lullaby she half remembered from her mother. Max lay at her feet, his large body sprawled protectively across the rug, amber eyes flicking toward the door the moment David stepped in. The German shepherd rose, tail wagging once before sitting at attention as if to report that nothing had gone wrong in his absence. "You did well," David murmured, crouching to scratch behind Max's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his chest rumbling with a low, pleased growl. Emily giggled softly at the sight, her earlier worry fading. Yet outside their fragile circle of safety, storms were gathering. Across town, in a smoky bar tucked beneath a flickering neon sign, Kyle Turner slouched over a whiskey glass. The bar smelled of stale beer and fried onions, its dim lights doing little to hide the rough edges of its patrons. Kyle's once polished suit now looked wrinkled, his tie discarded. Sweat dampened his forehead despite the winter chill outside. He muttered curses under his breath, draining another glass. A young man watched him carefully from a booth nearby. His name was Mark Reynolds, a 26-year-old journalist freshly hired at the Denver Chronicle. Mark had an eager face framed by unruly blonde hair, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, and a notebook always within reach. He was ambitious, curious to a fault, and had grown up in a small Colorado town where corruption often went unnoticed. That upbringing had given him a fierce sense of justice and a hunger for stories others ignored. Mark had been investigating rumors surrounding Richard Parker's sudden death. He knew whispers of switched medication had begun circulating but needed confirmation. Seeing Kyle drinking heavily and muttering to himself was too tempting an opportunity to ignore. Kyle slammed his empty glass down and motioned for another. His words slurred as he leaned toward the bartender. "She promised I'd have it all, said the money would come easy. But now it's slipping. That damned soldier, that mutt, that brat kid, they'll ruin everything." The bartender, a stout man in his 50s named Hank, rolled his eyes. He'd heard too many drunk confessions to care. But Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding. He slid into the stool beside Kyle, feigning casual interest. "Rough night?" Mark asked. His voice was calm, friendly, not at all like a reporter chasing a lead. Kyle eyed him blearily. "You don't know the half of it, kid. That woman Madeline," she said, "just change the pills, just swap them, nobody would ever know. And now look at me, drowning in cheap whiskey while she's playing queen of the mansion." Mark froze, his hand tightening around his pen. His mind raced. Change the pills, swap them. This was the confession he'd been searching for. He kept his face neutral, careful not to spook the drunk man. "Sounds like you've been carrying something heavy." Kyle laughed bitterly. "Heavy? It's killing me, piece by piece. But if I go down, she goes down with me. She was the one who gave the order." Don't you forget that Mark excused himself shortly after, heart pounding as he hurried into the cold night. He flipped open his phone and replayed the voice memo he had secretly recorded. The muffled sound of Kyle's slurred confession filled his ears. It was messy, but it was proof. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, David tried his hand at cooking. He had promised Emily something more than bread and canned beans. The result was a half-burnt attempt at scrambled eggs, but Emily ate with gratitude, laughing softly at his clumsy efforts. Ethan gurgled happily in his high chair, banging a spoon against the tray. The knock at the door startled them all. Max was on his feet instantly, a growl reverberating from deep in his chest. David motioned for Emily to stay back and opened the door cautiously. Rebecca Lawson stood there, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a stack of files tucked beneath her arm. "David," she said briskly, stepping inside, "we need to talk." Rebecca set the files on the table and began spreading them out. Her expression was serious, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been reviewing Richard's medical records again. There are inconsistencies. His heart medication showed traces of substitution. Someone tampered with it." Emily's eyes widened. "Does that mean someone hurt Daddy on purpose?" Rebecca hesitated before kneeling to Emily's level, her voice softening. "It means someone may have done something very wrong, sweetheart. but we're going to find the truth." David straightened, his fists clenching. "I already suspected as much. Richard was too careful with his health. He wouldn't just collapse without cause," Rebecca nodded. "If we can connect this to Madeline or Kyle, we'll have grounds not only to remove her guardianship permanently, but also to open a criminal investigation." Emily looked toward Max, who had settled back at her side, his warm body pressed against her legs. She stroked his fur and whispered, "Max will protect us." Rebecca smiled faintly. "And I believe he will." Later that night, after Rebecca had left with promises to push the case further, Emily sat by the fire sketching with a stub of pencil on scrap paper. She drew 3 figures: herself, Ethan, and Max, standing beside a tall man with broad shoulders and a kind smile. She labeled him carefully, David. David noticed the drawing when he walked past. He crouched down, staring at it in silence for a long moment before placing his hand gently on her head. "That's a fine picture," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't often show. Emily looked up at him. "Will you stay with us? For always?" David's throat tightened. He remembered the battlefield promises he had once made to men who never came home. He would not break this one. "Yes, Emily. For always." At that same hour, Mark Reynolds sat hunched over his desk in his small apartment, replaying Kyle's confession again and again. He typed feverishly, drafting a story that, if published, would explode across Denver. But he knew he needed more. He needed corroboration, another witness, something solid to withstand Madeline's inevitable denials. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, determination burning in his chest. The city outside buzzed with ordinary life, but for Emily, Ethan, David, Max, and those entangled around them, the battle for truth and survival had only just begun. The Denver courthouse loomed against the pale winter morning, its stone columns streaked with years of wind and snow. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, buzzing with whispers from reporters, neighbors, and curious citizens who had all been drawn by rumors of scandal in one of the city's most prominent families. The air smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, the kind of scent that lingered in places where justice had been argued for decades. David Collins arrived at the steps carrying Ethan in one arm while Emily held his other hand tightly. Max padded beside them, his large paws steady on the stone steps, amber eyes scanning the crowd with military precision. The German shepherd wore a plain leather harness, his black and tan coat gleaming in the cold light. Though dogs weren't typically allowed in courtrooms, Rebecca Lawson had argued successfully for Max's presence, explaining that his role in protecting the children was not only practical, but also deeply tied to their sense of safety. Emily clutched her small sketchbook to her chest, her gray-blue eyes flickering nervously at the sea of faces. David bent down briefly and murmured, "Stay close. Remember, no matter what's said inside, you tell the truth." She nodded, her lips pressed tight, and Max gave a low whine, pressing his head gently against her leg as if to offer reassurance. Inside the courtroom, Madeline Parker was already seated. She wore a crimson dress that stood out sharply against the somber wood paneling. Her hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless, but her cold blue eyes betrayed the tension beneath the surface. Beside her sat Laura Bennett, her attorney, a tall, imposing woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones, platinum blonde hair pinned in a severe bun, and an aura of icy control. Laura had a reputation for dismantling opponents with brutal cross-examinations, and her confident posture radiated that same intent today. Rebecca Lawson stood at the opposite table, her gray suit neat, her brown eyes focused but calm. She had spent nights preparing documents and evidence. Though her frame was slender, she carried herself with unshakable authority. Seated near her was Mark Reynolds, the young journalist who had been subpoenaed to testify about the recording he had made of Kyle's drunken confession. His messy blonde hair had been combed nervously for the occasion, but his eager eyes betrayed his youth. The presiding judge, Edward Hill, entered the room with slow, deliberate steps. A man in his mid-50s, Judge Hill had a tall, thin frame, graying hair neatly combed back, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He was known throughout Denver for his stern demeanor and his particular compassion toward children. He struck the gavel, and silence fell like a heavy curtain. "Court is now in session," Judge Hill intoned. Laura Bennett rose immediately. Her voice rang out clear, practiced, each word carefully chosen. "Your Honor, we are here because these children, Grace and Ethan Parker," she motioned disdainfully toward Emily and Ethan, "have been improperly influenced by outside parties. My client, Mrs. Parker, their legal guardian, has been portrayed unfairly. We intend to show that any accusations against her are baseless and born out of manipulation by Mr. David Collins, who has no legal standing. David's jaw tightened, but he remained still. Rebecca, calm as stone, stood next. Your Honor, the issue here is not influence. It is the safety and well-being of two children. The will of the late Richard Parker left the estate to his children. Mrs. Parker's guardianship is conditional, and we will present evidence that she and her associate Kyle Turner not only failed in their duty, but may have directly contributed to Mr. Parker's death. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Madeline's face remained frozen, but her hand gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles pale. The first witness called was Mark Reynolds. He walked nervously to the stand, adjusting his glasses. Under oath, his voice trembled at first, but as he began describing his encounter with Kyle Turner at the bar, his tone steadied. He explained how Kyle had confessed to switching Richard's medication under Madeline's instruction, how he had recorded the confession. The recording was played, the muffled voice of Kyle slurring out damning words. The courtroom buzzed again, pens scratching furiously across reporters' notebooks. Laura Bennett rose like a hawk. Mr. Reynolds, you are a journalist seeking recognition, are you not? A young man eager to make his name? Mark flushed, but held firm. Yes, I want the truth reported. But this is not ambition. This is about two children who deserve justice. Rebecca gave him an encouraging nod, and he stepped down, shoulders squared with newfound resolve. Next came Emily. David squeezed her hand gently before she walked to the stand, Max trailing close until the bailiff gently guided him to sit by the bench. Emily's small frame looked even smaller against the tall wooden witness chair. Her gray-blue eyes shimmered with fear, but she held her sketchbook in her lap like a shield. Rebecca's questions were gentle, her tone almost maternal. Emily, can you tell us what happened the day your stepmother accused you of stealing? Emily's voice shook at first, but she told the story. How the dollar bill had been planted, how she had never touched it, how Madeline had shouted and thrown her and Ethan out into the cold. Her eyes welled with tears and her voice cracked when she added, "If Max and Mr. Collins hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened to us." Max, as if understanding her words, let out a soft bark. The courtroom stirred, some smiling faintly at the dog's loyalty. Laura Bennett rose for cross-examination, her expression sharp. Emily, you are 7 years old. Children sometimes make mistakes, don't they? Sometimes they even take things without realizing. Emily shook her head fiercely. I didn't take it. I know what's right and wrong. Daddy taught me. Laura's lips pursed, but she pressed on. And this Mr. Collins, he told you to say these things, didn't he? Emily's eyes widened. She clutched her sketchbook and whispered, No. He told me to tell the truth. Her words were quiet, but they rang through the silence. Judge Hill leaned forward slightly, his stern gaze fixed on Laura. The child has answered. Move on. The tension thickened as the trial continued, but it was clear that the tide had begun to turn. Rebecca introduced medical reports, phone records, and financial transfers linking Madeline to unusual activity just before Richard's death. Though the case was far from concluded, the foundation of truth was taking root. When the session adjourned, reporters swarmed the hall. David shielded Emily and Ethan, Max pressing tightly against their legs, his presence like a living wall. Rebecca walked beside them, her voice steady. We've taken the first step. But this battle isn't over. David nodded, his soldier's instincts bracing for the long fight ahead. He glanced down at Emily, who looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks but a glimmer of hope in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she believed that justice might be possible. The following morning dawned gray over Denver, the sky heavy with snow clouds that threatened another storm. Inside David Collins's modest apartment, warmth radiated from the small fireplace as Emily stirred awake on the couch, Ethan curled beside her. Max, ever vigilant, stood at the window, his pointed ears twitching at the faint sounds of traffic below. The German shepherd looked every bit the soldier he once trained to be, muscular, disciplined, his amber eyes glowing with quiet intelligence. David sat at the table with Rebecca Lawson, their files spread out between mugs of half-drunk coffee. He wore a plain gray sweater, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, fatigue etched into his face. Rebecca, in a navy blazer, looked sharper than ever, her brown hair pulled back neatly, but even she showed signs of strain, faint lines of worry creasing her forehead. "We need Kyle to testify," Rebecca said firmly. "The recording was powerful, but the court will press for corroboration. If he speaks under oath, it could seal the case against Madeline." David leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Kyle's a coward. He'll run before he admits the truth." Rebecca's lips tightened. "Then we'll have to corner him before he disappears." At that moment, Emily padded over in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Mr. Collins?" she asked softly. "Will Max come with us to court again?" David crouched down, resting a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "Yes, Emily. He'll always be there. So will I." Max pressed his head into Emily's side as if to punctuate the promise. Across the city, Kyle Turner was unraveling. He sat slumped in a cheap motel room, the curtains drawn tight, a half-empty bottle of bourbon by his bed. His once sharp blue suit lay crumpled on the chair, replaced by a stained undershirt and wrinkled slacks. Sweat dampened his thinning blonde hair, his face pale and hollow-eyed. He jumped when someone knocked at the door. "Who is it?" he barked, voice hoarse. "It's me," came the cold reply. Madeline Parker stepped inside, her crimson coat brushing against the faded carpet. She looked immaculate as always, but her mask of composure was cracking her jaw tight, her eyes flashing with desperation. "You're drinking yourself into ruin," she hissed. "Pull yourself together. If you testify, we're finished." "Both of us." Kyle's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I can't take it anymore, Madeline. That soldier's staring me down in court. The girl's looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. Maybe I am. Maybe I should just tell the truth." Madeline's nails dug into his arm. "Don't you dare. If I go down, I'll drag you with me." Unbeknownst to them, someone else had been watching. Sarah Miller, a nurse in her late 30s with kind hazel eyes and auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail, had been staying in the next room. She had grown up in a rough Denver neighborhood, and life had given her an instinct for danger. She worked double shifts at the local hospital and often stayed at this rundown motel between shifts to save money. That morning she had overheard every word through the paper-thin walls. Her jaw clenched as she recognized the names. Parker, Collins. The scandal splashed across every newspaper. She quietly pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd seen in the article. Mark Reynolds, the journalist. By afternoon, Mark hurried into David's apartment, breathless, his glasses fogged from the cold. He carried his battered leather satchel, paper spilling from the edges. "We have a witness," he blurted. "A nurse." She overheard Kyle and Madeline at a motel. "She's willing to talk." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "What's her name?" "Sarah Miller. Works at Denver General. She's tough, grew up fighting her way out of trouble. She said she's tired of watching the powerful crush everyone else. She wants to help." David leaned forward, his soldier's instincts stirring. "Then we need to protect her, too. If Madeline finds out—" "She already suspects," Mark interrupted grimly. "Sarah said she saw Madeline's car outside her motel this morning. She's scared, but she refuses to back down." Emily, sitting on the rug with Max's head in her lap, looked up. "Will the nurse help Daddy's name be cleared?" Rebecca smiled gently. "Yes, Emily. With her testimony, your father's truth will shine." That evening, David met Sarah Miller at the hospital cafeteria. The sterile smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, but Sarah herself seemed grounded, practical. She wore scrubs under a heavy parka, exhaustion evident in her posture, yet her hazel eyes glowed with determination. "I don't scare easily," she said, folding her arms. "But when I heard them talk, I knew I couldn't keep quiet. Richard Parker deserves justice, and those kids—" She hesitated, her voice softening. "They deserve a chance at a real childhood." David studied her carefully. Her face bore faint lines from years of overwork, but she radiated honesty. He extended his hand. "Thank you. You're doing more than you know." Max, who had accompanied David, pressed close to Sarah, sniffing her hand before sitting beside her, his approval clear. Sarah chuckled. "Smart dog. He can probably sense when someone's lying." "He can," David said with a faint smile. "That's why I trust him with my life." Meanwhile, Madeline paced her mansion, fury building with each passing hour. The whispers in the courtroom, the press coverage, the way Rebecca had exposed her cracks, it was slipping from her grasp. She stared at her reflection in the grand mirror, flawless on the outside, but her eyes told another story. "I will not lose everything to a child and a broken soldier," she muttered to herself. Her phone buzzed. It was Laura Bennett, her attorney, sharp and controlled even over the line. "The nurse is a threat. If she testifies, it's over. We must discredit her before the next hearing." Madeline's lips curved into a cold smile. "Then let's destroy her credibility." Everyone has a weakness. Back at David's apartment, the small family tried to cling to normalcy. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor drawing again, sketching Max with exaggerated ears and a superhero cape. Ethan crawled clumsily across the rug, babbling nonsense. For the first time, David allowed himself a faint laugh as Emily proudly showed him the picture. "Max the super dog," she announced. Max wagged his tail, as though he understood his new title. Rebecca arrived later that night with new court documents. Her face looked tired but resolute. "The hearing has been moved up," she explained. 2 days from now. That gives us little time, but it means Madeline has less time to spin her lies." David glanced at Emily and Ethan, then at Max lying faithfully at their feet. He felt the soldier in him awaken fully. The same man who had once led squads through firefights now stood ready to defend 2 children and the truth of his fallen friend. "Then we'll be ready," David said, his voice firm, "no matter what storm she brings." In the end, this story is not only about a soldier, 2 children, and a loyal German shepherd. It is about how truth can never be buried, how love can heal even the deepest wounds, and how God places people and even animals in our lives as miracles to protect us when we are weakest. Emily and Ethan found a father in David, and David found a family he never thought he deserved. Max, with his faithful heart, reminds us that God's creation often speaks louder than human words. Every day in our own lives we may face lies, betrayals, or struggles that feel impossible to carry. But just as God sent light into Emily's darkness, He can send light into ours too. Sometimes the miracle comes as a person who stands by us, sometimes as a faithful animal, sometimes simply as strength in our own hearts that we did not know was there. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so others can also feel its message. Leave a comment, tell us your thoughts, and if you believe that God still works miracles today, type Amen in the comments to stand with Emily, Ethan, David, and Max. Please subscribe to the channel so that we can continue sharing stories of hope and healing. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and love in every step of your journey.